"Hello! Below there!" When he heard a voice thus calling to him, he was standing at the door of his box with a flag in his hand, furled round its short pole. One would have thought, considering the nature of the ground, that he could not have doubted from what quarter the voice came, but instead of looking up to where I stood on the top of the steep cutting nearly over his head, he turned himself about and looked down the line. "Hello! Below!" From looking down the line, he turned himself about again and, raising his eyes, saw my figure high above him. "Is there any path by which I can come down and speak to you?" Just then, there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back, as though it had force to draw me down. When such vapour as rose to my height from this rapid train had passed me and was skimming away over the landscape, I looked down again and saw him refurling the flag he had shown while the train went by. I repeated my inquiry. He motioned with his rolled-up flag towards a point on my level some 200 or 300 yards distant. The cutting was extremely deep and unusually precipitate. It was made through a clammy stone that became oozier and wetter as I went down. He was a dark, sallow man, with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His post was in as solitary and dismal a place as ever I saw. On either side, a dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of sky. The perspective one way, only a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon. The shorter perspective in the other direction, terminating in a gloomy red light, and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel, in whose massive architecture there was a barbarous, depressing and forbidding air. Before he stirred, I was near enough to him to have touched him. Not even then removing his eyes from mine, he stepped back one step and lifted his hand. He directed a most curious look towards the red light near the tunnel's mouth and looked all about it, as if something were missing from it, and then looked at me. That light was part of his charge, was it not? He answered in a low voice. "Don't you know it is?" I detected in his eyes some latent fear of me. "You look at me as if you had a dread of me." I was doubtful whether I'd seen you before. "Where?" He pointed to the red light he had looked at. "My good fellow, what should I do there? However, be that as it may, I never was there. You may swear." "I think I may." His manner cleared, like my own. He replied to my remarks with readiness and in well-chosen words. Had he much to do there? Exactness and watchfulness were what was required of him, and of actual work, manual labour, he had next to none. To change that signal, to trim those lights, and to turn this iron handle now and then, was all he had to do under that head. Was it necessary for him, when on duty, always to remain in that channel of damp air? And could he never rise into the sunshine from between those high stone walls? Why, that depended upon times and circumstances. In bright weather he did choose occasions for getting a little above those lower shadows, but, being at all times liable to be called by his electric bell, and at such times listening for it with a redoubled anxiety, the relief was less than I would suppose. He took me into his box, where there was a fire, a desk for an official book in which he had to make certain entries, a telegraphic instrument with its dial face and needles, and a little bell of which we had spoken. Once he had to stand without the door and display a flag as a train passed, and make some verbal communication to the driver. I should have set this man down as one of the safest of men to be employed in that capacity, but for the circumstance that while he was speaking to me, he twice broke off with a fallen colour, turned his face towards the little bell when it did not ring, opened the door of the hut, and looked out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. On both of those occasions, he came back to the fire with an inexplicable air. Said I when I rose to leave him, "You almost make me think that I've met with a contented man." I believe I used to be so, but I'm troubled, sir." "With what?" It's very difficult to impart, sir. It's very, very difficult to speak of. If ever you make me another visit, I will try to tell you." but I expressly intend to make you another visit. Say when it shall be. I go off early in the morning, and I shall be on again at 10 tomorrow night, sir. I will come at 11. I'll show my white light, sir, till you have found the way up. When you have found it, don't call out. And when you are at the top, don't call out. What made you cry, hello, below there, tonight? Well, no doubt because I saw you below. For no other reason? Well, what other reason could I possibly have? You had no feeling that those words were conveyed to you in any supernatural way? No. He wished me good night and held up his light. The distant clocks were striking 11. He was waiting for me at the bottom of the path with his white light on. I have made up my mind, sir, that you shall not have to ask me twice what troubles me. I took you for someone else yesterday evening. Who? I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face, and the right arm is waved. Violently waved. This way. I followed his action with my eyes, and it was the action of an arm gesticulating with the utmost passion and vehemence, "For God's sake, clear the way." One moonlight night, said the man, I was sitting here when I heard a voice cry, "Hello, below there." I looked from that door and saw this someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving as I just now showed you. The voice seemed hoarse with shouting, and it cried, "Look out, look out!" And then again, "Hello, below there, look out!" I caught up my lamp, turned it on red, and ran towards the figure, calling, "What's wrong? What's happened here? Where?" It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel. I ran right up at it and had my hands stretched out to pull the sleeve away when it was gone. Within 6 hours after the appearance, the memorable accident on this line happened, and within 10 hours, the dead and wounded were brought along through the tunnel over the spot where the figure had stood. A disagreeable shudder crept over me. This was just a year ago. 6 or 7 months passed, and I had recovered from the surprise and shock, when one morning, as the day was breaking, I, standing at that door, looked towards the red light and saw the spectre again. Did it cry out? No. It was silent. Or did it wave its arm? No. It leaned against the shaft of the light, with both hands before the face. That very day, as a train came out of the tunnel, I noticed a carriage window on my side. What looked like a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal to the driver, "Stop!" He shut off and put his brake on, but the train drifted past here 150 yards or more. I ran after it, and as I went along, heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died suddenly in one of the compartments, and was brought in here and laid down on this floor between us. I could think of nothing to say to any purpose, and my mouth was very dry. The wind and the wires took up the story with a long, lamenting wail. He resumed, "Now, sir, mark this and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since, it has been there, now and again by fits and starts, at the light, at the danger light. And what does it seem to do?" He repeated, if possible with increased passion and vehemence, that former gesticulation, "For God's sake, clear the way." It calls to me in an agonized manner, "Below there, look out, look out." It stands waving to me. It rings my little bell. I caught at that. "Did it ring your bell yesterday evening when I was here, and you went to the door?" "Twice." "And did the spectre seem to be there when you looked out?" "It was there." "Both times?" "Both times." By this time you will fully understand, sir, that what troubles me so dreadfully is the question, what does the spectre mean? I was not sure that I did fully understand. What is it warning against? What is the danger? Where is the danger? Some dreadful calamity will happen. What can I do? If I telegraph danger on either side of me, or on both, I can give no reason for it. They would think I was mad. When I saw him in this state, I saw that for the poor man's sake, as well as for the public safety, what I had to do for the time was to compose his mind. I represented to him that whoever thoroughly discharged his duty must do well, and that at least it was his comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand these confounding appearances. He became calm. The occupations incidental to his post as the night advanced began to make larger demands on his attention, and I left him at 2 a.m. That I more than once looked back at the red light as I ascended the pathway, that I did not like the red light, and that I should have slept but poorly if my bed had been under it, I see no reason to conceal. Next evening was a lovely evening, and as I walked out early to enjoy it, the sun was not yet quite down when I traversed the field path near the top of the deep cutting. Before pursuing my stroll, I stepped to the brink and mechanically looked down, from the point from which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me when, close at the mouth of the tunnel, I saw the appearance of a man, with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. The nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment, for in a moment I saw that this appearance of a man was a man indeed, and that there was a little group of other men standing at a short distance, to whom he seemed to be rehearsing the gesture he made. The danger light was not yet lighted. Against its shaft a little low hut, entirely new to me, had been made of some wooden supports and tarpaulin. It looked no bigger than a bed. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, with a flashing, self-reproachful fear that fatal mischief had come of my leaving the man there and causing no one to be sent to overlook or correct what he did, I descended the notched path with all the speed I could make. "What is the matter?" I asked the men. "Signalman killed this morning, sir." "Not the man belonging to that box?" "Yes, sir. He was cut down by an engine, sir. No man in England knew his work better. But somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. It was just at broad day. He had struck the light and had the lamp in his hand. As the engine came out of the tunnel, his back was towards her, and she cut him down. That man drove her, and he was showing how it happened. Show the gentleman, Tom." Coming round the curve in the tunnel, sir, I saw him at the end like as if I saw him down a perspective glass. There was no time to check speed, and I knew him to be very careful. As he didn't seem to take heed of the whistle, I shut it off when we were running down upon him and called to him as loud as I could call. "What did you say?" "I said, 'Below there, look out, for God's sake clear the way.'" I started. "Oh, it was a dreadful time, sir. I never left off calling to him. I put this arm before my eyes not to see, and I waved this arm to the last, but it was no use." Without prolonging the narrative, I may, in closing it, point out this coincidence. The warning of the engine driver included not only the words which the unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also the words which I myself, not he, had attached to the gesticulation he had imitated. "For God's sake, clear the way." She was one of those pretty and charming girls, born, as she thought, by a blunder of destiny into an ordinary family. She had no dowry, no expectations, no means of being known, understood, loved, married by a rich man. And she let them make a match for her with a little clerk in the Department of Education. She suffered intensely, feeling herself born for every delicacy and every luxury. She suffered from the poverty of her dwelling, from the worn walls, the worn chairs, the ugliness of the furnishings. She let her mind dwell on quiet halls, hung with oriental tapestries, lighted by tall lamps of bronze, with tall footmen in knee breeches. She let her mind dwell on large parlours, decked with old silk, with their delicate furniture, supporting precious objets d'art, and on coquettish little rooms, perfumed, prepared for afternoon assignations with the most intimate friends, men who were well known and sought after, whose attentions all women envied and desired. When she sat down to dine before a shabby tablecloth in front of her husband, who lifted the cover of the tureen, declaring with an air of satisfaction, "Ah, good old stew, there's nothing better than that," she was thinking of delicate repasts with glittering silver. She was thinking of exquisite dishes served on marvellous platters, of compliments whispered and received with a sphinx-like smile, while she was toying with the rosy flesh of a trout or the wings of a quail. She had no dresses, no jewellery, nothing. But she loved nothing else. She felt herself made for that world. She would so much have liked to please, to be envied, to be seductive and sought after. She had a rich friend from her convent days whom she did not like to go and see any more, so much did she suffer when she went there. And she wept all day long from chagrin, from regret, from despair, and from distress. But one evening her husband came in with a proud air, holding in his hand a large envelope. There's something for you. The Minister of Education begs Monsieur and Madame Loisel to do him the honour of dining with him at the Palace of the Ministry on 12th night. Instead of being delighted, as her husband hoped, she threw the invitation on the table with annoyance, murmuring, "What do you want me to do with that? But, my dear, I thought you'd be pleased. You never go out, and here's a chance, a fine one. I had the hardest work to get it. Everybody is after them. They are greatly sought for, and not many are given to the clerks." She looked at him with an irritated eye, and she declared with impatience, "Well, what do you want me to wear?" He had not thought of that. He hesitated. "But the dress you wear to the theatre, that looks fine to me." He shut up, astonished and distracted at seeing that his wife was weeping. He stuttered, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" But by a violent effort she replied in a calm voice as she wiped her damp cheeks, "Nothing. Only I have no clothes and I can't go to this party. Give your card to some colleague whose wife has a better outfit than I do." He was disconsolate. He began again. "See here, Mathilde. How much would this cost? A proper dress which would do on other occasions. Something very simple." She reflected a few seconds, going over her calculations, and thinking also of the sum which she might ask without meeting an immediate refusal and a frightened exclamation from the frugal clerk. At last she answered, "I don't know exactly, but it seems to me that with 400 francs I might do it." He grew a little pale, for he was reserving just that sum to buy a gun and treat himself to a little shooting the next summer. But he said, "All right, I'll give you your 400 francs, but make sure it's a pretty dress." The day of the party drew near, and Madame Loisel seemed sad, restless, anxious. Yet her dress was ready. One evening her husband said to her, "What's the matter? Come, now, you've been quite odd these last 3 days. It annoys me not to have a jewel, not a single stone to put on. I would almost rather not go to this party. Go find your friend, Madame Forestier, and ask her to lend you some jewellery. You know her well enough to do that." She gave a cry of joy. "That's true. I'd not thought of it." The next day she went to her friends and told her about her distress. Madame Forestier went to her mirrored wardrobe, took out a large casket, brought it, opened it, and said to Madame Loisel, "Choose, my dear." She saw at first bracelets, then a necklace of pearls, then a Venetian cross of gold set with precious stones of an admirable workmanship. Then, all at once, she discovered in a box of black satin a superb necklace of diamonds, and her heart began to beat with overwhelming desire. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. She fastened it round her throat, on her high dress, looked ecstatically in the mirror. Then she asked, hesitating, full of anxiety, "Can you lend me this?" "Yes, Yes, certainly. She sprang to her friend's neck, kissed her with ardour, and then escaped with the treasure. The day of the party arrived. Madame Loisel was a success. She was the prettiest of them all, elegant, gracious, smiling, and mad with joy. All the men were looking at her, inquiring her name, asking to be introduced. All the cabinet secretaries wanted to dance with her. The minister took notice of her. She danced with delight, with passion, intoxicated with pleasure, thinking of nothing but the triumph of her beauty, the glory of her success. She went away about 4 in the morning. Since midnight, her husband has been dozing in a little anteroom with 3 other men whose wives were having a good time. He threw over her shoulders the wraps he had brought to go home in, modest garments of everyday life, the poverty of which was out of keeping with the elegance of the ball dress. She felt this, and wanted to fly so as not to be noticed by the other women who were wrapping themselves up in rich furs. When they were in the street they could not find a carriage, and they set out in search of one, hailing the drivers whom they saw passing in the distance. They went down to the Seine, disgusted, shivering. Finally, they found on the quay one of those old night-hawk cabs which you see in Paris only after night has fallen, as though they are ashamed of their misery in the daytime. It brought them to their door, Rue des Martyrs, and they went up their own stairs sadly. For her it was finished, and he was thinking that he would have to be at the ministry at 10 o'clock. She took off the wraps with which she had covered her shoulders before the mirror, so as to see herself once more in her glory. But suddenly she gave a cry. She no longer had the necklace around her throat. Her husband, half undressed already, asked, "What is the matter with you? I've not got Madame Forester's diamond necklace." He jumped up, frightened. "What? How? That's not possible." And they searched in the folds of the dress, in the folds of the wrap, in the pockets, everywhere. They didn't find it. He asked, "Are you sure you still had it when you left the ball?" "Yes, I touched it as we were leaving the ministry. But if you had lost it in the street, we should have heard it fall. It must be in the cab." "Yes, that must be it. Did you take the number?" "No." "And you? You didn't even look at it?" "No." They gazed at each other, crushed. At last Loisel dressed himself again. "I'm going back the whole distance we came on foot to see if I can find it." She stayed there, in her ball dress, without strength to go to bed, overwhelmed on a chair, without a fire, without a thought. Her husband came back about 7 o'clock. He had found nothing. Then he went to police headquarters, to the newspapers to offer a reward, to the cab company. He did everything, in fact, that a trace of hope could urge him to. She waited all day, in the same dazed state in the face of this horrible disaster. Loisel came back in the evening, with his face worn and white. He had discovered nothing. "You must write to your friend. Tell her you've broken the clasp of the necklace and that you're having it repaired. This will give us time to turn round." At the end of a week they had lost all hope, and Loisel, aged by 5 years, declared, "We must replace those jewels." Then they went from jeweller to jeweller, looking for a necklace like the other. In a shop in the Palais Royal, they found a diamond necklace that seemed to them absolutely like the one they were seeking. It was priced 40,000 francs. They could have it for 36. Loisel possessed 18,000 francs, which his father had left him. He had to borrow the remainder. He borrowed, asking 1,000 francs from one, 500 from another, 5 here, 3 louis there. He made ruinous agreements, dealt with brokers, with all kinds of loan sharks. He signed his life away, risked his signature without even knowing whether it could be honoured, and, frightened by all the anguish of his future, he went to buy the diamond necklace, laying down on the jeweller's counter 36,000 francs. When Madame Loisel took back the necklace to Madame Forestier, the latter said with an irritated air, "You ought to have brought it back sooner. I might have needed it." Madame Loisel learned the horrible life of poverty. She made the best of it, frankly, heroically. The frightful debt must be paid. She would pay it. She learned to do rough household work, odious work in the kitchen. She washed the dishes, wearing out her pink nails on the greasy pots and the bottoms of the pans. She washed the dirty linen, the shirts and the towels which she dried on a rope. She carried down the garbage to the street every morning, and she carried up the water, pausing for breath on every floor. And, dressed in working clothes, she went to the fruiterer, the grocer, the butcher, a basket on her arm, bargaining, insulting, fighting for her wretched money, sou by sou. The husband worked in the evening, keeping up the books of a shopkeeper, and at night often he did copying at 5 sous the page. At the end of 10 years they had paid everything back. Madame Loisel seemed old now. She had become hard and rough, someone from a poor household, badly combed, with her skirts awry and her hands red. Her voice was loud, and she washed the floor with splashing water. But sometimes, when her husband was at the office, she sat down by the window and she thought of that evening long ago, of that ball, where she had been so beautiful and so admired. Then, one Sunday, as she was taking a walk in the Champs-Élysées, she perceived suddenly a woman walking with a child. It was Madame Forestier, still young, still beautiful, still seductive. Madame Loisel felt moved. Should she speak to her? Yes, certainly. And now that she had paid up, she would tell her all, why not? She drew near. "Good morning, Jean." "Madam, I don't know you, do I? Are you mistaking me for someone else?" "No, Jean. I'm Mathilde Loisel." Her friend gave a cry. "Oh, my poor Mathilde, how you've changed!" "Yes, I've hit hard times since I last saw you and had many troubles, and all because of you." "Of me? How?" "You remember that diamond necklace that you lent me to go to the ball at the ministry?" "Yes." "Well, I lost it." "How can you have? You brought it back to me." "I brought you back another just like it. And for the last 10 years we've been paying for it." "You say that you bought a diamond necklace to replace mine?" "Yes. You didn't even notice it, did you? They were exactly alike." And she smiled with proud and naive joy. Madame Forestier, much moved, took her by both hands. "Oh, my poor Mathilde. But mine were false. At the very most, they were only worth about 500 francs. My dear courier, no man would believe me if I were to state to him the plain and indisputable fact that one night last month, on my way up to bed, shortly after midnight, having been neither smoking nor drinking, I saw confronting me upon the stairs a figure in which I recognized my very self in every form and feature. I noticed in the face of this confronting figure every indication of all the bad qualities which I know myself to possess, and realized that that thing was, as far as I knew, entirely independent of my true self. To you alone have I hinted as to the troubles which have oppressed me, and to you they are confided only because of the demand you have made that I explain to you the extraordinary complication in which the Christmas story sent you last week has involved me. On Wednesday, you accused me of perpetrating a trifling and to you excessively embarrassing practical joke. And on Thursday, you reiterated the accusation, coupled with a demand for an explanation of my conduct satisfactory to yourself, or my immediate resignation from the staff of the Idler. To explain is difficult, for I am certain that you'll find the explanation too improbable for credence. But explain I must. In August, you informed me that you would expect me to provide a story for the Christmas issue of the Idler. I undertook the commission, and upon 7 different occasions set about putting the narrative into shape. I found great difficulty, however, in doing so, For some reason or other, I could not concentrate my mind upon the work. One story, however, I did finish, but after it came back to me from my typewriter, I read it, and was filled with consternation to discover that it was nothing more nor less than a mass of jumbled sentences. It was then I went to you and told you, as you remember, that I was worn out and needed a month of absolute rest, which you granted. I left my work wholly and went into the wilderness, where I could be entirely free from everything suggesting labour, and where no summons back to town could reach me. I was able, at the end of my vacation, to come back to town greatly refreshed and, as far as my feelings went, ready to undertake any amount of work. On the 4th day after my arrival, you came to me and said that the story must be finished at the very latest by October 15th, and I assured you that you should have it by that time. That night, I set about it. I mapped it out, incident by incident, and before starting up to bed had actually written some 12 or 1500 words of the opening chapter. When I had gone thus far, I experienced a slight return of one of my nervous chills, and, on consulting my watch, discovered that it was after midnight. I locked up the windows and doors, turned out the lights, and proceeded upstairs to my room. It was then that I first came face to face with myself, that other self in which I recognized, developed to the full, every bit of my capacity for an evil life. Imagine the horror of it, and then ask yourself if it was likely that when next morning came I could by any possibility bring myself to my work table in fit condition to prepare for you anything at all worthy of publication in the Idler. At the end of the week I felt better, and again I started in, and the story developed satisfactorily until it came again, and once more I was plunged into hopelessness. Thus matters went on until the 14th day of October, when I received your peremptory message that the story must be forthcoming the following day. At 7:30 on the evening of October the 15th, I was sitting in my library trying to write, when my front door bell rang. On opening it, I saw standing before me a man of 50-odd years of age, tall, slender, pale-faced, and clad in sombre black. He was entirely unknown to me. "Does Mr. Thurlow live here?" "I am Mr. Thurlow." "Henry Thurlow, the author?" "Yes. Don't I look like an author?" He laughed and candidly admitted that I was not the kind of looking man he had expected to find from reading my books. I ushered him into my library and inquired as to his business with me. He replied that he had been a reader of my writings for a number of years, and that for some time past he had had a great desire to meet me and tell me how much he had enjoyed my stories. "I have taken the keenest delight in reading your verses and humorous sketches. I may go further and say to you that you have helped me over many a hard place in my life by your work." I was quite won over to him by his simplicity, as well as attracted to him by his kindly opinion of my own efforts, and I did my best to entertain him, showing him a few of my little literary treasures in the way of autographed letters, photographs, and presentation copies of well-known books from the authors themselves. He observed quietly that I appeared to him to lead the ideal life, and added that he supposed I knew very little unhappiness. Well, I can't say that I know little unhappiness. At the present moment, I am very much embarrassed through my absolute inability to fulfill a contract into which I've entered, and which should have been filled this morning. I was due today with a Christmas story, and I am utterly unable to write it. What kind of story is it to be? Oh, the usual ghostly tale, with a dash of the Christmas flavour thrown in here and there to make it suitable to the season. It may be that I have not come altogether inopportunely. Perhaps I can help you. For 10 years I have secretly been at work myself on a story. It is a short one, but it has seemed good to me. It is a story which I have written and rewritten time and time again in my leisure moments during the last 10 years. It is not likely that I shall ever write another. I'm proud of having done it, but I should be prouder yet if it could in some way help you. I leave it with you, sir, to print or to destroy. And if you print it, to see it in type will be enough for me. To see your name signed to it will be a matter of pride to me. Take it. It's yours. He pressed the manuscript into my hands, and before I could reply had opened the door and disappeared into the darkness of the street. And then I read the story. When I began, it was with a half-smile upon my lips, and with a feeling that I was wasting my time. The smile soon faded, however. After reading the first paragraph, there was no question of wasted time. The story was a masterpiece. I read it once and was amazed. I read it a second time and was tempted. It was mine. The writer himself had authorized me to treat it as if it were my own. Not only this, he had almost intimated that in putting my name to his work, I should be doing him a favor. Why not do so then? I asked myself, and immediately my better self rejected the idea as impossible. How could I put out as my own another man's work and retain my self-respect? I had just resolved on another and better course, to send you the story in lieu of my own, with a full statement of the circumstances, when that demon rose up out of the floor at my side. This time more evil of aspect than before, more commanding in its manner. With a groan I shrank back into the cushions of my chair, and by passing my hands over my eyes, tried to obliterate forever the offending sight. But it was useless. The uncanny thing approached me, and as truly as I write, sat upon the edge of my couch, where for the first time it addressed me. "Fool," it said. "How can you hesitate? Here is your position. You've made a contract which must be filled. You are already behind and in a hopeless mental state. Even granting that between this and tomorrow morning you could put together the necessary number of words to fill the space allotted to you, what kind of thing do you think that story would make? It would be a mere raving like that other precious effort of August. On the other hand, if you don't have the story ready by tomorrow, your hold on the idler will be destroyed. There is the story in your hands. Think what it will do for you. It's one of the immortal stories. I shall not use it. You must. Consider your children. But it would be a crime. Not a bit of it. Whom do you rob? Think of it as it is. And act. Only act quickly. It is now midnight." The tempter rose up and walked to the other end of the room, whence, while he pretended to be looking over a few of my books and pictures, I was aware he was eyeing me closely, and gradually compelling me by sheer force of will to do a thing which I abhorred, and I struggled weakly against the temptation, but gradually, little by little, I yielded and finally succumbed altogether. Springing to my feet, I rushed to the table, seized my pen, and signed my name to the story. There! It's done! I've saved my position and made my reputation, and am now a thief, as well as a fool. If you send that manuscript to Courier, he'll know in a minute it isn't yours. He knows you haven't a secretary, and that handwriting isn't yours. Copy it. I did so. When it was finished, I went over it carefully, and went out to the mailbox on the corner, where I dropped it into the slot and returned home. When I returned to my library, my visitor was still there. "Well? I wish you'd hurry and complete this affair. I'm tired and wish to go." "You can't go too soon to please me," said I, gathering up the original manuscripts of the story. "Probably not, but I can't go until that manuscript is destroyed. As long as it exists, there's evidence of your having appropriated the work of another. Why can't you see that? Burn it." I thrust the pages one by one into the blazing log fire and watched them as they flared and flamed and grew to ashes. As the last page disappeared in the embers, the demon vanished. I was alone, and throwing myself down for a moment's reflection upon my couch, was soon lost in sleep. It was noon when I again opened my eyes, and 10 minutes after I awakened, your telegraphic summons reached me. "Come down at once," was what you said, and I went. You handed me the envelope containing the story. "Did you send that?" was your question. "I did, last night, or rather early this morning. I mailed it about 3 o'clock. I demand an explanation of your conduct." "Of what?" "Look at your so-called story and see. If this is a practical joke, Thurlow, it's a damned poor one." I opened the envelope and took from it the sheets I had sent you, 24 of them. They were every one of them as blank as when they left the paper mill. I turned and rushed madly from the office, leaving the mystery unexplained. You know that you wrote demanding a satisfactory explanation of the situation or my resignation from your staff. This courier is my explanation. It is all I have. It is absolute truth. I beg you to believe it. For if you don't, then is my condition a hopeless one. Be sympathetic, courier, or, if you cannot, be lenient with me this time. Believe, believe, believe. I implore you. Signed, Henry Thurlow. The following is a note from George C. Courier. Dear Henry, your explanation has come to hand. As an explanation, it isn't worth the paper it is written on. But we are all agreed here that it is probably the best bit of fiction you ever wrote. It is accepted for the Christmas issue. Enclosed, please find cheque for £100. Yours ever, G. Courier. Leonard Bilsiter was one of those people who have failed to find this world attractive or interesting, and who have sought compensation in an unseen world of their own experience or imagination. Children do that sort of thing successfully, but children are content to convince themselves and don't vulgarise their beliefs by trying to convince other people. Leonard Bilsiter's beliefs were for the few, that is to say, anyone who would listen to him. His dabblings in the unseen might not have carried him beyond the customary platitudes of the drawing-room visionary if accident had not reinforced his stock-in-trade of mystical lore. In company with a friend who was interested in a Ural mining concern, he had made a trip across Eastern Europe at a moment when the great Russian railway strike was developing from a threat to a reality. Its outbreak caught him on the return journey, somewhere on the further side of Perm, and it was while waiting for a couple of days at a wayside station, in a state of suspended locomotion, that he made the acquaintance of a dealer in harness and metalware, who profitably whiled away the tedium of the long halt by initiating his English travelling companion in a fragmentary system of folklore that he had picked up from trans-Baikal traders and natives. Leonard returned to his home circle garrulous about his Russian strike experiences, but oppressively reticent about certain dark mysteries which he alluded to under the resounding title of Siberian Magic. The reticence wore off in a week or two under the influence of an entire lack of general curiosity, and Leonard began to make more detailed allusions to the enormous powers which this new esoteric force, to use his own description of it, conferred on the initiated few who knew how to wield it. His aunt, Cecilia Hoops, who loved sensation perhaps rather better than she loved the truth, gave him as clamorous an advertisement as anyone could wish for by retailing an account of how he had turned a vegetable marrow into a wood pigeon before her very eyes. As a manifestation of the possession of supernatural powers, the story was discounted in some quarters by the respect accorded to Mrs. Hoop's powers of imagination. However divided opinion might be on the question of Leonard's status as a wonder worker or a charlatan, he certainly arrived at Mary Hampton's Christmas house party with a reputation for pre-eminence in one or other of those professions, and he was not disposed to shun such publicity as might fall to his share. Esoteric forces and unusual powers figured largely in whatever conversation he or his aunt had a share in, and his own performances, past and potential, were the subject of mysterious hints and dark avowals. "I wish you could turn me into a wolf, Mr. Bilsiter," said his hostess at luncheon the day after his arrival. "My dear Mary," said Colonel Hampton, "I never knew you had a craving in that direction." "A she-wolf, of course," continued Mrs. Hampton. "It would be too confusing to change one's sex as well as one's species at a moment's notice." "I don't think one should jest on these subjects," said Leonard. "I'm not jesting. I'm quite serious, I assure you. Only don't do it today. We have only 8 available bridge players and one would break up one of our tables. Tomorrow we shall be a larger party. Tomorrow night, after dinner. In our present imperfect understanding of these hidden forces, I think one should approach them with humbleness rather than mockery," observed Leonard, with such severity that the subject was forthwith dropped. Clovis Sangrail had sat unusually silent during the discussion on the possibilities of Siberian magic. After lunch he sidetracked Lord Pabham into the comparative seclusion of the billiard-room and delivered himself of a searching question. "Have you such a thing as a she-wolf in your collection of wild animals? A she-wolf of moderately good temper?" Lord Pabham considered. "There is Louisa, a rather fine specimen of the timber wolf. I got her 2 years ago in exchange for some Arctic foxes. Most of my animals get to be fairly tame before they've been with me very long. I think I can say Louisa has an angelic temper, as she-wolves go. Why do you ask?" "I was wondering whether you could lend her to me tomorrow night," said Clovis, with the careless solicitude of one who borrows a collar stud or a tennis racket. "Tomorrow night? Yes, wolves are nocturnal animals, so the late hours won't hurt her," said Clovis, with the air of one who has taken everything into consideration. "One of your men could bring her over from Pabham Park after dusk, and with a little help he ought to be able to smuggle her into the conservatory at the same moment that Mary Hampton makes an unobtrusive exit." Lord Pabham stared at Clovis for a moment in pardonable bewilderment. Then his face broke into a wrinkled network of laughter. "Ho, ho, ho! Oh, that's your game, is it? You're going to do a little Siberian magic on your own account. And is Mrs. Hampton willing to be a fellow conspirator?" "Mary is pledged to see me through with it, if you will guarantee Louisa's temper." "I'll answer for Louisa," said Lord Pabham. By the following day the house party had swollen to larger proportions, and Bilsiter's instinct for self-advertisement expanded duly under the stimulant of an increased audience. At dinner that evening he held forth at length on the subject of unseen forces and untested powers, and his flow of impressive eloquence continued unabated while coffee was being served in the drawing-room, preparatory to a general migration to the card-room. His aunt ensured a respectful hearing for his utterances, but her sensation-loving soul hankered after something more dramatic than mere vocal demonstration. "Won't you do something to convince them of your powers, Leonard?" she pleaded. "Change something into another shape. He can, you know, if only he chooses to," she informed the company. "Oh, do," said Mavis Pellington earnestly, and her request was echoed by nearly everyone present. Even those who were not open to conviction were perfectly willing to be entertained by an exhibition of amateur conjuring. Leonard felt that something tangible was expected of him. "Has anyone present got a threepenny bit or some small object of no particular value?" "Oh, you're surely not going to make coins disappear or something primitive of that sort," said Clovis contemptuously. "I think it's very unkind of you not to carry out my suggestion of turning me into a wolf," said Mary Hampton, as she crossed over to the conservatory to give her macaws their usual tribute from the dessert dishes. "I have already warned you of the danger of treating these powers in a mocking spirit," said Leonard solemnly. "Oh, I don't believe you can do it," laughed Mary provocatively from the conservatory. "I dare you to do it if you can. I defy you to turn me into a wolf." As she said this, she was lost to view behind a clump of azaleas. "Mrs. Hampton," began Leonard with increased solemnity, but he got no further. A breath of chill air seemed to rush across the room, and at the same time the macaws broke forth into ear-splitting screams. "What on earth is the matter with those confounded birds, Mary?" exclaimed Colonel Hampton. At the same moment, an even more piercing scream from Mavis Pellington stampeded the entire company from their seats. In various attitudes of helpless horror or instinctive defence, they confronted the evil-looking grey beast that was peering at them from amid a setting of fern and azaleas. Mrs. Hoops was the first to recover from the general chaos of fright and bewilderment. "Leonard!" she screamed shrilly to her nephew. "Turn it back into Mrs. Hampton at once. It may fly at it at any moment. Turn it back." I don't know how to," faltered Leonard, who looked more scared and horrified than anyone. "What?" shouted Colonel Hampton. "You've taken the abominable liberty of turning my wife into a wolf, and now you stand there calmly and say you can't turn her back again?" To do strict justice to Leonard, calmness was not a distinguishing feature of his attitude at the moment. "I assure you I didn't turn Mrs. Hampton into a wolf. Nothing was farther from my intentions." "Then where is she? And how came that animal into the conservatory?" "Of course we must accept your assurance that you didn't turn Mrs. Hampton into a wolf," said Clovis politely. "But you will agree that appearances are against you. Are we to have all these recriminations with that beast standing there ready to tear us to pieces?" wailed Mavis. "Lord Pabham, you know a good deal about wild beasts," suggested Colonel Hampton. "The wild beasts that I've been accustomed to have come with proper credentials from well-known dealers or have been bred in my own menagerie. I've never before been confronted with an animal that walks unconcernedly out of an azalea bush. As far as one can judge from outward characteristics, it has the appearance of a well-grown female of the North American timber wolf, a variety of the common species Canis lupus." "Oh, never mind its Latin name," screamed Mavis as the beast came a step or two further into the room. "Can't you entice it away with food and shut it up where it can't do any harm?" "If it really is Mrs. Hampton, who has just had a very good dinner, I don't suppose food will appeal to it very strongly," said Clovis. "Leonard!" beseeched Mrs. Hoops tearfully. "Even if this is none of your doing, can't you use your great powers to turn this dreadful beast into something harmless before it bites us all? A rabbit or something?" "I don't suppose Colonel Hampton would care to have his wife turned into a succession of fancy animals as though we were playing a round game with her," interposed Clovis. "I absolutely forbid it," thundered the Colonel. "Most wolves that I've had anything to do with have been inordinately fond of sugar," said Lord Pabham. "If you like, I'll try the effect on this one." He took a piece of sugar from the saucer of his coffee cup and flung it to the expectant Louisa, who snapped it in mid-air. There was a sigh of relief from the company. A wolf that ate sugar, when it might at least have been employed in tearing macaws to pieces, had already shed some of its terrors. The sigh deepened to a gasp of thanksgiving when Lord Pabham decoyed the animal out of the room by a pretended largesse of further sugar. There was an instant rush to the vacated conservatory. There was no trace of Mrs. Hampton except the plate containing the macaw's supper. "The door is locked on the inside," exclaimed Clovis, who had deftly turned the key as he affected to test it. Everyone turned towards Bilsiter. "If you haven't turned my wife into a wolf," said Colonel Hampton, "will you kindly explain where she's disappeared to, since she obviously could not have gone through a locked door? I will not press you for an explanation of how a North American timber wolf suddenly appeared in the conservatory, but I think I have some right to inquire what has become of Mrs. Hampton." Bilsiter's reiterated disclaimer was met with a general murmur of impatient disbelief. "I refuse to stay another hour under this roof," declared Mavis Pellington. "If our hostess has really vanished out of human form," said Mrs. Hoops, "none of the ladies of the party can very well remain. I absolutely decline to be chaperoned by a wolf." "It's a she-wolf," said Clovis soothingly. The sudden entry of Mary Hampton deprived the discussion of its immediate interest. "Someone has mesmerised me," she exclaimed crossly. "I found myself in the game larder, of all places, being fed with sugar by Lord Pabham. I hate being mesmerised, and the doctor has forbidden me to touch sugar." The situation was explained to her. as far as it permitted of anything that could be called explanation. "Then you really did turn me into a wolf, Mr. Bilsiter," she exclaimed excitedly. But Leonard had burned the boat in which he might now have embarked on a sea of glory. He could only shake his head feebly. "It was I who took that liberty," said Clovis. "You see, I happen to have lived for a couple of years in northeastern Russia, and I have more than a tourist's acquaintance with the magic craft of that region. One does not care to speak about these strange powers, but once in a way, when one hears a lot of nonsense being talked about them, one is tempted to show what Siberian magic can accomplish in the hands of someone who really understands it. I yielded to that temptation. May I have some brandy? The effort has left me rather faint." If Leonard Bilsiter could at that moment have transformed Clovis into a cockroach and then have stepped on him, he would gladly have performed both operations.